Good day. Today, March 23rd, the world, including the Western world, is still trying to digest the implications of the visit of Xi Jinping, the president of China, to Moscow, and his various discussions there with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and indeed between the two big delegations, the Chinese and the Russian, which participated in the Moscow talks. I'll come back to the Russian-Chinese discussions later in this program. But before I do that, I'm going to return to that perennial topic of this channel, which is the war in Ukraine and what has exactly been going on over the course of the fighting in the last 24 hours. Well, I'm going to do that not by trying to put together all the various bits and bobs of information from the various battlefronts as I usually do, but on this occasion by discussing or passing on the information provided by two Russian sources, which in my opinion I've generally found reasonably reliable in their discussion of the fighting. Now, one is a commentator known as Yuri Podolyaka. He is, I believe, actually of Ukrainian origin, and he's somebody who, as I said, frequently discusses events on the battlefronts, and I think that with some qualifications, he is somebody who is generally considered to be one of the most interesting and insightful and accurate of Russian reporters. That, of course, is not to dispute in any way his biases, which are obviously pro-Russian, though I believe he is actually of Ukrainian origin. Anyway, this is his dispatch, which he published yesterday, and it reads as follows. We, by that, of course, he means the Russians, have success in the Avdeevka area. In the evening, that's yesterday evening, information came out that Russian troops attacking had reached the highway from the Novo-Bakhmutovka area. Now we're trying to go towards Novo-Kalinovo. Thus, the encirclement from the northern part of Avdeevka is expanding. This is logical. An attack cannot be launched along a narrow corridor. Otherwise, the grouping would be easily cut off and destroyed. Russian troops are expanding their offensive foothold and are systematically encircling Avdeevka from the north. So far, by contrast, there have been no serious advances from the south, although Russian artillery and aviation are working there. On the one hand, the distance, and he means the distance from the south, is shorter, but is more difficult to cross because of difficult geography. The enemy also throws reserves into defending this area. The armed forces of Ukraine understand that if they surrender another 2 or 3 kilometers from the north or the south, the situation for their forces in Avdeevka will change catastrophically for the worse. Supplying the group will become very difficult. So, will the fate of Bakhmut await Avdeevka? Is the environment close? I would not, this is him speaking again, I would not set clear deadlines. It depends on whether the strategic reserves will be transferred to the area by the armed forces of Ukraine. Such a transfer would reduce Russian options. Incoming advances would be likely to be blocked. The situation would develop depending, therefore, on the actions of both sides. If nothing changes, then in 3 to 4 weeks, the situation of the Ukrainian military in Avdeevka will worsen. So that's Yuri Podolyaka's account of the fighting going on in Avdeevka. And in fact, yesterday there was a cascade of reports about significant Russian advances in the Avdeevka area, that the Russians are pressing hard in and around Avdeevka and are making real progress there. And then he discusses the situation in Bakhmut, and he says US analysts say progress in Bakhmut, he means progress by the Russians, is slowing down as activities in other areas have intensified. Is it so? And he goes on to say partly yes, but the weather also prevents both us and the enemy from manoeuvring. Dirt roads are closed for us. We can attack from fewer directions. The fighters of the Wagner organization therefore have focused on the assault within Bakhmut itself. The off-road factor is less critical. And in fact, there's been a lot of information about the fighting in Bakhmut. And then he goes on to discuss what's going on further south still, in Marinka and Vugleda, and he says there are local battles. The concentrated strike ended as the Vugleda operation has been curtailed. Reserves, he means Russian reserves, were transferred to the Avdeevka direction. So this is Podolyaka's view. He takes the view that after hitting obstacles in the attempt to capture Vugleda back in January and February, the Russians switched forces from Vugleda and concentrated them instead around Avdeevka, and that's why they've been able to achieve so much progress over the last few weeks in the fighting in and around Avdeevka. But note that he says that a lot will depend on what the Ukrainians do. Will they transfer forces from their strategic reserves, in other words, from furthest from central and western Ukraine, to try to hold back Russian advances in Avdeevka? If they don't, then the situation for them in Avdeevka would become critical, and he guesses this will happen within a month. And in the meantime, he says that because of the difficult weather conditions around Bakhmut, not only has a Ukrainian counterattack been postponed in the Bakhmut area, but with the roads leading into Bakhmut, the asphalt roads leading into Bakhmut, subject to continuous Russian shelling, it makes more sense for the Wagner forces, instead of trying to maneuver across open fields and country lanes themselves, as they try to press attacks on places like the village of Orekhovo-Vasilievka, it makes more sense for them to push on, fighting inside Bakhmut, breaking down Ukrainian resistance there. So that's Yuri Podolyaka's account of what's going on. Now, there's been another report, which I get to turn to now, and this is from Redovka. Redovka is, as I said, a Russian newspaper, very much, as I've said before, on the patriotic, nationalist, pro-war end of the Russian political spectrum. I believe, as I said before, that it's published in Smolensk rather than Moscow. But it's a useful source because it has reporters all over the battlefronts, and again, it's fairly well informed about what's going on the battlefronts, and it provides fairly accurate updates, or so up to now I have found, of what is going on the various battlefields. And Redovka yesterday gave a report about what's going on the various battlefronts. It says that Wagner, and this is now talking about Bakhmut, but Wagner is moving in the direction of Orekhovo, Vasilievka, Bogdanovka and Grigorovka. These are these villages to the northwest of Bakhmut, where the Russians have been pushing, trying to capture these villages, but they've been slowed down, according to Podolyaka, by the heavy weather, the difficult weather, and by other reports, also by Ukrainian artillery. And anyway, Avdeevka then goes on to say, fierce fighting continues in the centre of Bakhmut. The territory of the industrial zone having been completely cleared of Ukrainian forces. Now, that is a claim from Avdeevka that the entirety of the Azov plant has now been captured by the Russians. Now, that contradicts information from Yuri Podolyaka that came out yesterday, which suggested that there are still Ukrainian troops holding out in parts of the Azov plant. But Avdeevka, which has reporters, as I said, on the ground, appears to believe that the Azov plant is now under Russian control. I want to stress I have no idea what position is myself. I'm not physically present. I have found Avdeevka up to now reliable in this sort of reporting. On balance, I would tend to go with them. But, I'm not suggesting definitely that this is the case. Anyway, Avdeevka then goes on to say there are heavy clashes on Korsugovo Street and near the intersection of Mariupolskaya and Sadovaya Street. And then he goes on to say to the south of the city, of Bakhmut, in other words, fighting continues at Krasnoye. And that's, of course, Ivanivska. It's one of those villages that sits astride the main roads, one of the two main roads that leads into Bakhmut from the west. So, still fighting going on for control of that village. And there was a report a few days ago that Ukraine has deployed 3 brigades specifically to this village, which gives us an insight as to how important this village is for Ukraine, for the Ukrainians to retain control of if they're to succeed in their defense of Bakhmut. Anyway, Avdeevka then goes on to talk about what's going on other battlefronts, and it says that the Russian armed forces continue to cover Avdeevka, both from the north and from the south. The Russian military are advancing on Pervomaiskoye from the direction of Pesok and Severnoye from Vodyanoye. These are all, I believe, places to the north of Avdeevka. And then it says that under the cover of artillery, Russian troops are trying to advance to the southern outskirts of Avdeevka. So this is a report very, very similar to Yuri Podolyaka's. The Russians are making progress in the areas, significant progress in the area north of Avdeevka, but their advance from the south is slower. And it then turns to the situation further south, near Orechov, the Zaporozhye area, and it says that Ukrainian troops have entrenched themselves in part of the village of Novodanilovka, located in the grey zone south of Orechov, and the Ukrainian military can use this village as a springboard for attacking the positions of the Russian army. Near Vugleda, Marines from the 155th Brigade continue to carry out combat missions attacking Ukrainian units in a coordinated manner, which is not really in any true sense a report at all. Anyway, that's an account of the fighting from 2 different sources. There's also, by the way, been a lot of more information from the fighting further north, from Kupiansk, Liman, Kremenaya, Saratovo. The British military, the Ministry of Defence, appears to accept that the Russians have continued to make progress in this area. And I saw some reports earlier today that the Russians are close to capturing a place, or at least have come close to a place called Mercouris, which was one of the places that they lost during Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn. And in the meantime, the British appear to acknowledge that the Russians are making significant advances towards Kupiansk. So I think one gets an overall sense here of the battle. The Russians are now focusing most of the fighting in the Bakhmut area on Bakhmut itself. If it is correct, as Avdeevka appears to think, that the Russians have captured the entirety of the Azov plant, and they have made very significant progress inside Bakhmut, and various reports put them very close now to the administrative buildings in Bakhmut and to other important locations inside Bakhmut. And as we know, a couple of days ago, the Russians were saying that they were in control of around 70% of the town. But it's clear that the Ukrainians still have positions there and they're still resisting, even though their supply lines for the moment remain extremely difficult. And elsewhere, we read reports that the Russians have made very considerable, actually very rapid progress around Avdeevka, that they switched forces from Vuhledar to Avdeevka when it became clear that an attempt to capture Vuhledar quickly would not succeed. And the result is that they've taken Avdeevka into semi-encirclement. But again, there is still fighting going on there. Now, there's been an awful lot of talk about a Ukrainian counterattack in this area, in the area of the Donbass. And earlier today, the Wagner organization gave its own guesstimate, I think it is only a guesstimate, of the totality of Ukrainian forces in north-central Donbass. They said that the Ukrainians have around 80,000 troops, not around Bakhmut, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka, with around 250 tanks, and they give other figures for artillery. I think these figures are too high, by the way, but I'll come to that in a moment for artillery and tanks. And on the subject of tanks, there's now some reports and some pictures which appear to suggest that there are Leopard tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, already deployed to this particular part of the battlefronts. And we've had a report from TASS quoting Yan Gagin, who gave an interview to Russia 1 television channel. And of course, we know that he's a advisor to Denis Pushilin, and he says that his TASS reports him saying there have been reports about Leopard tanks and armoured personnel carriers appearing on the Bakhmut front line. Currently, foreign-made equipment is not being massively deployed in combat. And so he says that, yes, there are some Leopard 2 tanks in the area. They've not actually been committed to fighting up to this point, and he clearly doesn't think that they're there in any very great numbers, not for the moment at least. Well, we'll see what happens with those. Now, I would say that a couple of days ago, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the titular head, if I can put it like that, of the Wagner organization, said that his forces in close to Bakhmut were facing a Ukrainian force of around 70,000 men. This latest report from the Wagner Group has provided us with some clarification. It's not the case, or so it seems to me, that there are 70,000 Ukrainian troops located in the immediate proximity of Bakhmut. Rather, we have 80,000 Ukrainian troops in total in north and central Donbass. That might be right, but of course it's unlikely that Ukraine would commit or would be able to afford to commit this entire force to an operation to relieve Bakhmut. That would leave places like Slavyansk, for example, dangerously exposed. So I think this global figure for Ukrainian forces in north-central Donbass, around 80,000, is probably about right. But it's not quite the huge army that Prigozhin was talking about. Nonetheless, the Wagner organization is again warning that Ukraine might be intending to launch some sort of offensive with these forces, and maybe they are. We'll have to wait and see. And at the same time, I should point out that there's been some comments by Ukrainian commanders again that when the weather clears up, they do intend to launch some kind of counterattack very soon. We don't know whether it's a Bakhmut counterattack or whether it's a counterattack further south towards Zaporozhye. It's still very unclear. Perhaps the Ukrainians are planning to launch two counterattacks at the same time. And the Wagner organization also claims that there is a significant concentration of Ukrainian troops in the Dnipro area. This has been also reported, of course, by other Russian officials. It doesn't give a number for this concentration of forces, but again, the implication is that this is probably the force that is going to be used as the core of any Ukrainian offensive south in Zaporozhye region. So we'll see. Now, I will say this. If Ukraine is indeed going to be deploying all these forces in some sort of offensive over the next few weeks, then it really does look to me like Ukraine pulling out the stops. They are going to be throwing everything they have into these last-ditch offensives that the US has been talking about, because, as we've seen, a military crisis for Ukraine is building. Its forces are becoming overextended, overstretched, they're suffering heavy losses in every area. The Russians have been putting pressure on every part of the battlefield, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for them. So they're also worried about the depth of US and Western support. So it's perhaps logical to think that they might want to carry out these last-ditch offensives. But if so, one has to wonder, even if these offensives are successful, what then? And if these offensives fail, what happens to Ukraine at that point? Anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians do. There was a report today from a Ukrainian channel that President Zelensky has made some kind of demand of General Zaluzhny, the commander, the overall commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, asking Zaluzhny to come out and make a public statement of his support for the Bakhmut operation. Now, it's not clear to me whether that refers to the defense of Bakhmut or to this proposed counterattack in the Bakhmut area. It could be either one. But again, that would suggest tensions between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, and presumably between Zaluzhny and the ground commander, General Syrskyi, who seems to be very committed to the fight for Bakhmut. And I have to say it's also perhaps reflected by this rather complicated double game that Zaluzhny seems to be playing, along with, in which on the one hand he seems to be agreeing with Zelensky and Syrskyi in private about such matters as the importance of defending Bakhmut, and at the same time he's coming back and passing on information through various anonymous sources, if you like, to the Ukrainian media, that he is in disagreement with what they're trying to do. So it's a complicated situation with General Zaluzhny. It suggests, again, misgivings and divisions within the Ukrainian leadership. And it also suggests that Zaluzhny, at least, has doubts and is, at least, the very least, hedging in case things go very badly wrong. Well, the one thing I have to say again is that the Ukrainians have telegraphed their intentions to the Russians. The Russians must be extremely well informed about what the Ukrainians are planning to do. They must presumably have their own plans about how to deal with any Ukrainian attacks, and all the indications are that they're going to be prepared for them. Now, yesterday I discussed at some length the extensive an article about Russian shell production, which has appeared in the article in a publication of the Jamestown Foundation. I said that the methodology used appeared to me to be profoundly wrong, and that one could easily pick holes in this particular article, and that whilst I didn't know how many shells the Russians produce in any one month, let alone year, it seemed to me overwhelmingly likely that it was significantly more than the author of this article said. And I also pointed out that the author of this article appeared to be was basing the calculations he was making in this article on the cost of producing a shell in Russia in 2005, and I suggested that that was an entirely different economic era for Russia, and I also suggested that at that time production of military goods, including shells, in Russia was extremely small, so that the unit cost of producing shells in 2005 would be extremely high. Well, I've now received what I consider to be authoritative confirmation of the last point from somebody who is extremely well informed about these matters, far better informed than I am. And this person has said that, to his knowledge, production of any sort of military goods in 2005 in Russia was on a very low scale, and that, just as I said yesterday, shell production, indeed military production in its entirety, would only have got underway seriously in Russia in the years subsequent to 2005. So I think that is the final nail, if you like, in that particular article. It suggests to me, it confirms to me the fundamental lack of proper methodology that underpins it. I'm returning to this subject because Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, but also the deputy chair of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. In other words, he's the man who is in effective charge of Russia's military industries, its military industrial complex. He's now said that Russia will be producing around 1,300 tanks over the course of 2023. Now, it's not clear exactly what he meant by that, but my clear impression was that he meant new tanks as opposed to just a mixture of old and refurbished tanks. Now, in terms of old and refurbished tanks, that would have been consistent with the figures that we were getting, that Russia was producing around 20 new tanks, presumably T-90Ms, each month at the Uralvagonzavod factory, and was probably modernizing around 80 tanks a month, both at Uralvagonzavod and at the other big tank factory in Omsk. And that would have resulted in around 100 tanks coming off the assembly lines every month, 20 new, 80 modernized, and that would come to around 1,200 tanks over the course of a whole year. But as I said, my impression is that Medvedev was actually talking about entirely new tanks, which logically would mean T-90Ms. Now, the T-90M is made in only one tank factory, which is Uralvagonzavod. Can Uralvagonzavod build 1,200 tanks, 1,200 T-90M tanks in a year? I mean, it would require production of such tanks at a rate of 100 a month. Well, I know many people will say no, and there are good reasons for skepticism. I mean, we're not just talking about the kind of tanks that used to be built in Uralvagonzavod way back in the middle years of the Cold War. Modern tanks like the T-90M have much more advanced armor, which of course is much more complicated to build. They also have very sophisticated electronics of a completely different level of sophistication to the kind of electronics that a tank would have had in, say, the mid-1960s. So it would require a much bigger industrial effort today to build 1,200 tanks than it would have done, new tanks, than it would have done, say, in 1960. Having said that, Uralvagonzavod is a simply enormous factory. Its workforce is said to number 30,000. Obviously, it can only build tanks depending on its supplies, and raw materials might be relatively easy to obtain, but some of this electronic equipment would presumably have to be built or provided or supplied in the necessary numbers by factories that make electronics, and that might be a challenge. Having said all of that, I'm not saying that Medvedev's number is correct. I'm not saying it's accurate. I think it might be risky to say that Uralvagonzavod cannot build 100 tanks, 100 new tanks in a month. And of course, Medvedev, unlike the rest of us, actually knows what the true rate of production is. So I just mentioned this. As I said, I don't want to draw too many conclusions from this. Most probably, Medvedev is talking about both new and modernized tanks, but he might be talking entirely about new tanks. And for what it's worth, his choice of words suggests to me that he was. But you know, that might be disinformation. It might not be true. Let's not assume it is true. But again, it provides us with a ballpark figure. So, large numbers of tanks coming from the Russians, be they entirely new or new and modernized, 1,300 a year, according to Medvedev. Probably lots of shells. And I see that Brian Beletic, like myself, believes that the Western powers are trying to surge supplies of shells to Ukraine, that the 1 million shells that the European Union says it's going to supply to Ukraine over the next 12 months is more probably going to be 1 million shells that the European Union is going to supply to Ukraine over the next 4 months. In other words, to sustain whatever offensives Ukraine is intending to launch over the next few weeks. But let me come back to my earlier points which both I and others, Brian Beletic in particular, have made previously. The Russians can sustain these levels of production. Nobody should be in any doubt about this. They're able to produce shells. They're able to go on producing shells. And in my program yesterday, I explained how, if production bottlenecks arise, because supply bottlenecks arise because of shortages of a particular raw material, it's not going to be difficult for Russia to access these supplies, especially with the colossal Chinese industrial machine working at their back. So the Russians can continue to produce military goods in enormous quantities. It's becoming increasingly clear that the West cannot. Ukraine will need shells for its offensive. 4 months of shells at 250,000 rounds, still less than what Russia fires on any particular day, could sustain an offensive, but once that number of shells runs out, then of course Ukraine will find itself in an extremely difficult position indeed. Now, there's other reasons to think that things are not looking particularly good on the battlefields. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, when he was strong-armed into agreeing to the supply of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, talked back in January of the Western powers, the EU, supplying 2 battalions worth of tanks, of Leopard 2 tanks. It's clear this isn't going to happen. And yes, some gaps are going to be filled by supplying Leopard 1 tanks. But as I've said already, this is a tank of the middle Cold War era. It's of the same time period as the T-62 and indeed the T-55, Russian tanks that people have been ridiculing for the Russians for deploying. I'm not sure, by the way, that the Russians are deploying T-55 tanks, but it does seem that in the Kherson area they have deployed some T-62s. Well, as I said, the Leopard 1 is also of that same period as the T-62 dates from. And in some ways, it is inferior to the T-62. In fact, not in some ways, in many ways, it is. It's got thinner armour, much thinner armour than the T-62 does. And the T-62 mounts a much more powerful gun. So, problems with tank supplies, and it doesn't look as if Ukraine is going to get the numbers of tanks it wants. Now, Leopard 2s that it wants. Now, the British are saying that they're going to provide a company of Challenger 2s. Some people wonder whether that means 14 or 28. My understanding is that the number remains 14, not 28. But they're trying to make up for the limited number of these tanks by supplying these depleted uranium shells. And it's become increasingly clear to me that this is a disastrous public relations own goal. I've been reading the international media. The Chinese media is full of this story. They're hugely critical of the British for what they're doing. There's been a fiery editorial about it in Global Times, saying basically that the British ought to be ashamed of themselves for supplying tank shells of this sort. So it's, in fact, I will say that it's the UK should be strongly condemned for this dirty act. That's the headline of the editorial in Global Times. And I think that this reflects a fairly widespread feeling across the international non-Western media. I think that whatever advantage these tank shells give to Ukraine, it's going to be very limited and in no way sets off the disastrous public relations effect, both for Britain and for the West generally, and indeed ultimately for Ukraine, that the transfer of these munitions is going to do. So, problems with numbers of tanks from the West. The number of tanks is nominal, and that may explain a rather interesting decision that has been made apparently by the United States. Now, when back in January the United States said that it would supply M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the implication was that these would be up-to-date tanks, but they would be new-build tanks because the United States was not prepared to provide tanks, M1 tanks, Abrams tanks to Ukraine with the same levels of armour protection as those that the US military has. The reason they weren't prepared to do that was because they were concerned that if the tanks fell into Russian hands, that would compromise the secrets of its armour plate. So they were going to build entirely new tanks, ordered from the manufacturer, the Lima plant, and these were to be built with up-to-date electronics, but a reduced armour specification. Well, that idea has now been abandoned, apparently, and the decision has been made to supply Ukraine with early generation M1 Abrams tanks dating from the early 1980s, which have lesser armour, certainly, but also less up-to-date, significantly less up-to-date electronics. They still have the same complex, difficult to maintain gas turbine engine. Now, these tanks, still probably very effective tanks, but they may not be significantly or indeed at all more effective than the T-90M tanks that the Russians are now fielding in increasing numbers. So why is the United States doing this? Well, I suspect it's because there's now a grudging understanding that there are not going to be more Leopard 2 tanks available to supply to Ukraine than the relatively small number that has already been committed. And the number of Leopard 2s, the total number is probably around 50. It's probably about 90 Leopard 1s. That's not enough to enable Ukraine to put together an effective armoured fist. So the United States, grudgingly and against its wishes, has had to make up the numbers by taking out of its stocks these old M1 Abrams tanks from the early 1980s and is intending to ship them to Ukraine some point this autumn. Now, that's all very well, but it doesn't provide Ukraine with tanks for an offensive this spring or summer. Now, I did wonder whether I heard this report, whether perhaps the idea of a spring-summer offensive might have been abandoned, and whether the decision has been taken instead to postpone the offensive to the autumn until these American tanks arrive. That might make some sense. And there's also reports that France, Macron, have decided to supply 10 Mirage 2000 fighter jets. These are old fighter jets, certainly inferior to the Russian Sukhoi 35s and Sukhoi 30s and Sukhoi 57s. Anyway, they're old fighter jets which France has been taking out of service, but apparently some Ukrainian pilots have been training on them, and there's rumours that France is intending to supply 10 of these fighter jets to Ukraine. Again, unlikely they would be available before the autumn. I did wonder whether perhaps the intention is to postpone this offensive until the autumn. By that point, the shells will have arrived from the EU, the million shells. There'll be more Western tanks. There'll be these Mirage fighter jets. There'll be those 33 MiG-29s, or what's left of them, by the time the autumn arrives. I have to say, I've thought about this. I think it's unlikely. I think the political imperative to launch an offensive now is just too strong. And I think that these machines, the tanks and the fighter jets, will probably appear on the scene at a time when the offensive, if it takes place, will have run its course. So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, the report that Ukraine is committing Leopard 2s to the Donbass front rather than to Zaporozhye, given the limited number of Leopard 2s that are being supplied, must be causing worry amongst NATO staffs, given that it's clear that the armoured punch behind the offensive is already being weakened. Anyway, lots of uncertainties for the moment, but it's important to stress that for the moment at least, the Russians continue to make it's the Russians who continue to make the advances. They're continuing to press forward in Bakhmut itself. Some suggestions that they've made significant grounds there. They're pressing forward around Avdeevka. They've achieved what looks like a significant breakthrough around Avdeevka. And they're making real progress, apparently, in the Kremenaya-Kupiansk area, even the British Defence Ministry admits. Now, let's return to the Chinese-Russian summit meeting. And I think this was a huge event, and it's fascinating to see how the Western media, Western governments are trying to cope with it. On the one hand, there's a strong inclination, a strong temptation to try to dismiss it, just to deny its significance, to reject its importance, to imply that this was somehow something that didn't turn out well. There's a curious article, by the way, by Con Coughlin, an old friend, well, he's not a friend, but somebody I often read in the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph in Britain, who's saying that the reason Xi Jinping went to Moscow was because he was basically reconnoitering the landscape in Moscow in anticipation of Russia's collapse and fragmentation following its defeat in Ukraine, with the Chinese already contemplating what juicy bits of Russia they're going to take over for themselves. It's not quite what the article says, but that's the implication behind it. And it's also, by the way, what the headline suggests. But anyway, so we've had that sort of range. There's suggestions that it be dismissed, that this is unimportant. And then we've had others, like Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's former Secretary of State, arch hawk, neocon, person who I personally have no time for at all, but he says that this is a disaster, that the Russians and the Chinese are coming together, that the United States, instead of creating differences between these two countries, has managed to bring them together, and that this is a disaster for the US. I agree on this, almost for the first time ever, with Mike Pompeo. Now, the purpose of this war, from a US point of view, and I think that we have an accumulation of articles in the neocon parts of the American media which all but confirm that. One of the purposes of this war was to break the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, this de facto alliance. And the initial idea was to cause some kind of a regime change to take place in Russia. It was anticipated the Russian economy was going to collapse, that would lead to President Putin's fall. And this was going to be the result of the sanctions blow, and Russia would become subordinated to the US, or it might indeed fragment, and that would leave China isolated and vulnerable. Well, that hasn't happened. And I think it became fairly clear during the spring and summer of last year, that it wasn't going to happen. So the emphasis was switched. This time, for a time period, there were attempts to feed Chinese doubts about the value of the friendship with Russia. There were all kinds of threats that if China got too close to Russia, that if it supplied arms to Russia, that if it gave diplomatic support to Russia, this would be very bad for China. It would provoke a strong Western reaction against China, and that there were also attempts to suggest to the Chinese that the Russians were acting irresponsibly, recklessly, that they had no real understanding of what the Russians were doing, that the Russians were these crazy people. And there were lots of articles suggesting that the Chinese had become skeptical of the value of their friendship with Russia. Well, that was a total non-starter, as I have always said. And by the way, the threats to the Chinese were a classic example of a Western bluff. And as I have said many, many times, the most foolish thing you can do is, in diplomacy, is to try to bluff China. Because if you do, your bluff is always going to be called. One of the purposes of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow was to make it absolutely clear to the West that in terms of the bluff of imposing Western sanctions on Russia, on China, in the event that China pressed forward with its relationship with Russia, well, the Chinese were calling that particular bluff. And they've now done so. And in fact, exactly as Pompeo has said, what has happened is that the relationship between these two great powers, China and Russia, has been made stronger. Now, in my last programme, I discussed the two joint statements that the Chinese and Russian governments have signed off on following Putin and Xi Jinping's meetings. And I said that I would return to the topic of those two joint statements once I had a text of those statements that I was confident in was correct. I'm afraid that for the moment, the two foreign ministries, the Chinese and the Russian foreign ministries, have not yet published such texts of these statements, and nor, interestingly, has the Kremlin. I presume that we will be getting these texts very soon. So I'm going to return to that topic in a future video. But before I sign off, there is just one further thing I do want to discuss coming out of this meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. Now, far too much Western commentary, as I discussed in my previous video about this visit, centred on the question of the supposed Chinese peace plan for Ukraine. And I've pointed out repeatedly that there is no Chinese peace plan, that this is a fiction that the Chinese have, or that the Chinese have done, is that they have set out certain underlying principles that they would apply in the event that peace were to be negotiated with respect to Ukraine. But I am going to suggest that there is actually one point to bear in mind about these Chinese moves, and it's one that the Russians have endorsed. Now, the Russians have made it absolutely clear that when negotiations do eventually take place in order to bring this conflict to an end, they are not prepared to work through Western mediators. They consider countries like France, Germany, Britain, the United States unacceptable mediators in this conflict, and they think the same, of course, of the EU as well as an institution. But of course, China might be a different matter, and of course, China has managed to maintain reasonably good relations with Ukraine as well. So it could be, and this is a possibility to bear in mind, that when a situation finally develops in which the Russians have achieved what, from their point of view, is the decisive military success in Ukraine, where they've reached that point where they've brought Ukraine to a point where they feel that they can start to negotiate seriously with Ukraine, that at that point the Russians might turn to the Chinese and ask the Chinese to mediate peace between them and Ukraine. Now, that means that though there is no Chinese peace plan for the moment, there is no Chinese mediation taking place at the moment. In 6 months' time, a year's time, next year, whenever the Russians feel that that point where they have achieved what they want on the battlefield has been reached, we might see China starting to take pole position and setting itself up as a potential mediator in this conflict. The Chinese setting out their basic points that they're going to follow in the event that they're asked to be mediators in the future. Well, that suggests to me that that's the plan, that the Chinese are positioning themselves to be possible future mediators in this conflict, and importantly, that they're doing it with the agreement and probably with the active support of the Russians. Well, that's me for today. Undoubtedly, we'll be having more developments soon. We'll see whether and in what form this Ukrainian counterattack, if it happens, materializes, and where that counterattack will be. In the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Links under this video. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links also below this video. You can check out our shop, where we have all sorts of great things which you can buy: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. More from me soon, and in the meantime, it only remains for me to wish you a very good day.